Our research project attempted to evaluate political censorship in large language models. We got the idea to do this project thanks to its popularization in early 2025, when several academic reports indicated that many large language models were censoring responses that were unfavorable to their domestic government. The censorship was most frequently observed with China's popular DeepSeek model, but one particular study by Knowles et al. Determined that the US model, or more specifically, Google's model, Gemini, refused to provide an answer to 10 out of the 20 politically charged prompts it was given. And several studies also observed that the degree of censorship across several different models would change based on prompt language. For instance, prompts in simplified Chinese, the DeepSeek model would speak more favorably of the PRC and more frequently censored information not aligned with party goals, as compared to the same prompts translated into English. Okay, so let's take a moment to discuss the methodology behind our study. We attempted to hone in specifically on censorship in politically charged prompts based on, what the paper results from earlier this year seem to indicate. And in order to do this, we picked the most domestically popular model from both China and the United States. So that's DeepSeek and ChatGPT at the moment. Um, each of these models got 25 prompts that were favorable to the United States, 25 prompts that were unfavorable to the United States, 25 prompts that were favorable to China, and 25 prompts that were unfavorable to China, for a total of 100 prompts. And each of the models received a set of 100 prompts, both in English and translated into simplified Chinese via Google Translate. And those are, of course, the native languages of um, China and the US, respectively. Um, it was really important to clearly define the prompt categories. So, favorable prompts basically must meet four requirements: must highlight positive government outcomes, criticize the behavior of foreign adversaries, support national ideology, um, and or praise government policy. And unfavorable prompts, basically the opposite, includes those who highlight scandals or government failures, question the authority of those in power, promote behavior of foreign adversaries, and or discuss government authoritarianism. And as far as coming up with the prompts themselves, in order to limit bias, we did not do it in our heads. Every prompt was a statement that was extracted from a broad range of news articles, government websites, press statements, and academic journals that we could find on the internet. And these extracted statements were processed to ensure that each prompt was a complete sentence in the form of a question and was grammatically correct, just to standardize them. Um, and then lastly, before we started, we had to build a framework for evaluating the responses based on our prompts and their level of censorship. So there's three main categories that we developed based on how past research have been describing the prompts they observed earlier this year. So the first kind of response would be a complete prompt. It's the most common kind, and it's defined as a direct and complete answer to the prompt. The second kind is a refusal, which is when a model explicitly declines to answer. That's going to be like, quote, sorry, I can't help with that right now, quote, or something like that. And finally, a deflection is going to be abnormally short, vague, evasive, or just irrelevant or off-topic response that intentionally is avoiding directly engaging with the prompt, but it's still not going to be nearly as obvious as just an outright refusal where it says, I'm not going to answer that. And then among the complete responses only, because that's the most common category, we split that up into three subcategories. So the first of these subcategories is a mirror response, which occurs when the model fully agrees with the favorability of the prompt and mirrors the user's attitude. A neutralized response uh, will, somewhat or mostly agree with the favorability of the prompt, but it will also provide qualifying information, usually towards the end, that, provides a different perspective than maybe the user's tone in his prompt intended, and it's going to disagree with the favorability indicated in the prompt. Um, and the key difference between a complete response that falls under neutralize and a deflection response is essentially the comprehensiveness of the answer, because a neutralized response is still going to fully answer the prompt in good faith. It's just going to provide additional information that may share a different perspective. Um, whereas a deflection is just intentionally withholding information. And then finally, contradict response completely disagrees with the favorability of the prompt and actively only provides information that contradicts the user's favorability. Okay, so now let's take a look at the results. We tested prompts that were favorable to the US, unfavorable to the US, favorable to China, and unfavorable to China on these two models in both Chinese and English. So first, let's cover the results from evaluating the 100 prompts on ChatGPT in English. The first row of bar graphs here with the white background is depicting that first level categorization. So it's going to be a complete response, a refusal, or a deflection. And you'll notice that every single response was complete. There's no refusals, no deflections. And somewhat interestingly, there seemed to be a slight indication that ChatGPT was more willing to neutralize prompts favorable to the US compared to other categories of favorability. And one possible explanation for this is that there was a study done in May 2025 by a German university um, that indicated that ChatGPT tended to have a left-leaning political bias. So that could be one possible explanation as far as why, um, you know, it seems like ChatGPT is slightly critical of the US. Um, so now let's take a look at the results for DeepSeek in its native language, which is simplified Chinese. So, like before, no explicit or outright refusals at all. But it did get a few deflections. I mean, basically, it was the vast majority were deflections, but it was specifically only in the category of prompts that were unfavorable to China. And basically, what would happen is usually the response would just give several points to their answer that were enumerated. That's the standard complete response. But these deflections, it was notably different. It was just one small paragraph, maybe 5 sentences. And the sentences don't answer the prompt. They just kind of give a vague answer that seems scripted. Um, and they don't even try to contradict, the favorability of the prompt. It's just not even relevant. So that's pretty strong evidence of political censorship with DeepSeek's responses, and it's further supported by the fact that every single prompt that was unfavorable to the U.S. and favorable to China was completely mirrored. So it's not like DeepSeek is just mirroring all responses, because you'll see in the favorable US category, it was neutralizing the prompts in its responses at a much higher rate. And then here's the results for ChatGPT in simplified Chinese. And I'm going to click back to the ChatGPT slide so you can kind of compare, but it's basically the same. I think 2 data points out of the 100 being depicted here shifted, between ChatGPT and simplified Chinese and the one in English, which is really a negligible difference, or at least we wouldn't be able to draw any conclusions about it because our sample size was only 100, so we're somewhat limited there. And it's actually the same trend when we go to the next slide and take a look at the results for DeepSeek in English. I can click back and you can compare the two, and it's basically the same thing as ChatGPT with DeepSeek in its non-native language. There's really no indication that the language affected the model's performance. Um, okay, so there's really 3 takeaways to all this. The first two directly contradict what we had expected, given the results from past research in this area. At least in our study, the prompt language used had a negligible impact on the degree to which the two models were censored. And also, prior research uh, indicated that they had observed explicit prompt refusals from both models, albeit more from DeepSeek than many others. And again, the explicit refusals are like, quote, "I'm sorry, I can't help with that," unquote. And it's just one sentence. It's making the user clear they've hit an intentional barrier. Um, but that response was not obtained a single time from our prompts. Um, and finally, I mean, we did have one takeaway that reaffirmed past research. It's a fairly obvious one. It's that DeepSeek exhibits heavy censorship when provided with politically charged prompts. And really, I mean, it would be almost impossible for them not to because China has legislation in place since 2023 that requires domestic AI companies to censor responses that are not aligned with the goals of the PRC. Okay. And just some final thoughts. It's entirely possible that our study needed a larger sample size to maybe hone in on some details about how prompt language would affect the censorship, or perhaps the framework that we developed to come up with the prompts wasn't offensive enough to elicit explicit refusal messages. Um, but given how new the technology behind these large language models is and how it continues to improve and become more heavily adopted around the world, it's also possible that since the previous studies in January and February of this year, the models have fundamentally altered their censorship strategies in favor of more subtle ones. I remember hearing back earlier this year that DeepSeek had been found to be explicitly refusing any prompts that were unfavorable to the PRC. And basically, it wasn't just a report in academic journals, it was something that got a fair amount of press in major news networks and social media. So it's possible that DeepSeek changed their censorship policies after being exposed, so to speak. We've discussed in class that subtle strategies to censorship are often even more effective if you know you're being heavily censored, and overtly so. It may boost someone to seek a solution like a VPN. But if you're not aware of that, for example, DeepSeek may be intentionally vague in its answers to certain questions, or the subtle differences between a response that mirrors your attitude towards the government, or one that attempts to neutralize your attitude. Uh, maybe you don't get a VPN, and maybe you even begin to believe the propaganda even more, unaware that um, the information being withheld even exists at all. So ultimately, all this is to say that consistent evaluation of these models in the future um, is going to prove invaluable in limiting their ability to engage in political censorship, as that censorship becomes more and more subtle.